My name is Jane Eliasof. I'm the Executive Director of the Montclair History Center, and Helen Fallon, who's our Vice President, is going to be my co-host, which means she's going to be watching in the chat room if anything pops up there. And also, she's going to make sure if anybody unmutes themselves and we're hearing things like dishes clanking or things like that, she's going to make sure that we're muted so everybody can hear. We've been doing these now since we shut down in April. Well, we shut down in March, but we've been doing them since April. And we really have been getting wonderful response from it. And I thank everybody who's been part of it with us. We are always grateful for your feedback on it, but also your donations as well. So you can give a donation to the Montclair History Center either by writing to 108 Orange Road in Montclair, New Jersey, 07042, and sending us a check. You can do it via Venmo, just look for Montclair History Center, or you can go on our website, montclairhistory.org, and just click the join or donate button. We love members as well. So with that, I will begin today's program, which we're calling People of Bloomfield Avenue Past. And these came out of the walking tours that we do, because I find that, yes, the architecture is interesting, and yes, the stories of how the town developed are interesting, but really the people are particularly interesting, at least to me. And so I thought what I would do is try and look at some of the people who have made Montclair and Bloomfield Avenue, have left their mark on Bloomfield Avenue in some way or another. And so that is what tonight's presentation is all about. We're going to look at a variety of people. The first one we're going to talk about is Mr. William Botsford. Some of you may know his name. He was the designer of the Lackawanna train station. He was born in Binghamton, New York on November 23rd, 1886. He grew up in Millport, New York. And this picture on the right-hand side is of his family home. And if you zoom in on that picture, you can actually see his family sitting there on that porch. And that little kid over in the corner right there is Mr. William Botsford. He went to Horseheads High School and was only one of two boys who graduated in a class of 8. And he left school at 18. At that point, he went to work for 2 years in the architectural office of Pierce and Bickford, which was located in Elmira, plus one in Rochester, worked there afterwards. He then realized he needed to study a little bit more and went to Cornell University College of Architecture. He graduated in 1909, and while he was there, he was noted for his drawing ability. In fact, one of his works hung in the library and still hangs in the library there today. He was also commissioned to do the cover of the Cornelian, which is the yearbook, in 1910. He also was a wrestler and continued that down when he moved to New Jersey, and he was a singer as well. He graduated, as I mentioned, in 1909 and went to work as the chief designer on the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. To do that, he moved down to Orange, New Jersey, and joined the YMCA there and continued to wrestle. And he begins to design train stations in both New York and New Jersey. These are some of the ones he did. He did Elmira, Bath, New Village, Hapatcong, Syracuse, Utica, Hoboken, Ithaca, and New Village. The Hoboken one, when I first heard that, I thought, wow, he designed that beautiful Hoboken train station. But no, I think he probably designed a depot somewhere, because that Hoboken train station was completed before he'd even graduated from Cornell. So this is one he did do. Quite imposing. I know that recently they were fighting hard to save it, and so one of these days I do want to get out to Lake Hapatcong to see it in person. It opened in 1911. He also did more simple designs, like this one in Basking Ridge that opened in 1912. And then he did this one in Utica. This is a picture from the period, but this is what it looks like today. So it really is quite a spectacular piece of architecture. So he really ran from the sublime to the over the top. So then he was told that he should be starting up on the Lackawanna train station in Montclair. And this is what was there at the time. This was the second train station in that area. And they wanted something that was more imposing, something that would really let you know that you'd arrived when you'd come to Montclair. They didn't want something that looked small and not particularly grand. So he designed this building. It's the building we all know today. And I just want to kind of walk you around a couple of things. Notice the horses and carriages right here. You can see the horse, the legs right there. So the horses and carriages, you see that the access to the train line is open there, and this beautiful sort of garden area in it. This is what it looks like today. And just to give you, go back 1 second, so you can see that now this is closed off. That beautiful parking area is now, or this beautiful garden area is now a parking lot. But the building itself still remains. It opened on Saturday, June 28th, 1913. It started grand celebrations. There was a band concert at the terminal at 12:45 p.m. At 1:12, the guests arrived on the train from New York City, and that was followed by a series of short exercises that included Mayor Christopher Hink giving an address and the response by the president of Lackawanna Railroad. Then all the dignitaries would proceed up Bloomfield Avenue to the Hotel Montclair, which was a big hotel off of Bloomfield Avenue on the hill between Verona and Montclair. So they all proceeded by automobile up Bloomfield Avenue to the Hotel Montclair for a luncheon. They had 2 more speeches. And then after lunch, they were driven around town, especially on South Mountain, so they could see all the big houses. And then down Claremont. And if there were time, it was planned that they would go over to Eagle Rock so they could see the view from the city. This is what they served for luncheon. I loved it. Martini cocktail, sherry and bitters, caviar on toast, little neck clam cocktail, clear green turtle soup, filet mignon, potatoes, green beans, fresh peas or string beans, Hotel Montclair punch, broiled spring chicken, julienne potatoes, grapefruit and endive salad, French ice cream, assorted cake, Roquefort cheese, cream cheese, Ben's toasted crackers, café noir, and of course, cigars and cigarettes. This is it, the train station, probably about 50, 60 years ago. And I just want to kind of point out a couple of things that are still there. See this? This was the horse trough. So when you would come in with your horse and carriage, if your horse was thirsty after riding up the dusty Bloomfield Avenue, he could take a drink from this trough. It is still there today. It is covered over with cement. And the other thing you see is this post over here, and that is still there today as well. So there are a lot of features of this house or of this building that are still there. Another interesting picture is now, this is almost if you're sitting on the building itself on the roof, looking across and looking east. This is what's known as the Crawford Building. And you can see the Crawford Building is still there today. Very little bit changed, but you can still see these double windows, and the parapet appears to have been cut off. So the top ends have been cut off on this, but nonetheless, it's still probably a very similar view across that street. This is the building's interior when it was part of the Pig and Prince restaurant, which closed, but really very, very grand. And this is a picture that I just got today from Rich Walkwell, who was on the earlier program. And what I really was taken by with this is, first of all, the openness of it. But second of all, this is on what is today known as Lackawanna Plaza. And this little area here I thought was interesting. And I went back to look and see what was there today. And well, let me get to that one in a minute. What you find is that little place is still there. That post is still there. And that little tree, I don't know if it's the same tree, but has grown up and now is a big tree. And I pointed to this because you can see that one of the things he designed was this below grade crossing for the trains, so that if you were driving along Grove, you would be able to drive by without having to worry about passing into the trains. After he finished Lackawanna Station, his next big job was doing the Tunkhannock Viaduct, also known as the Nicholson Bridge, in Nicholson, Pennsylvania. It was completed in 1915. It was used to carry freight trains, but now passenger cars also go on it. And yes, it is still in use over 100 years later. It spans half a mile and rises 240 feet above that water below it. In 1975, the American Society of Civil Engineers named the viaduct a National Historic Civil Engineering Landmark. And in 1977, it made its way onto the National Register of Historic Places. And if you're looking for something to do, once a year in September, they do a Nicholson Bridge Day, and the town goes all out and has a parade and activities and all sorts of other fun things. So that is probably one of his most remarkable works. Now, William decided that he was going to go and travel to Egypt and Turkey and Europe to study architectural design and techniques. Unfortunately, when he was leaving Europe, he bought a ticket number 237670 for 13 pounds and boarded the Titanic as a second-class passenger. He clearly didn't make it, and a memorial service was held at the Orange, New Jersey YMCA. And one of his friends from Cornell made the following statement about him. He left a record of modesty and unselfishness, which led his friends at the very first to give up hope that he might have been rescued. He would have thought first of the women and children, and then of those having greater responsibilities than he. In 1912, the Botsford family sued the Oceanic Navigation Company, which was the owner of the Titanic, for $75,000 for the wrongful death of their son, and they were awarded $8,000. And that's the story of William Botsford. The next man we're going to talk about is Edward Madison, and you may recognize this building. It's 427 Bloomfield Avenue. And for many, many years, it was the home of the Edward Madison Company, which was a stationers, booksellers, and printers. So we're going to start first with his early years. He was born in 1851. His parents, Thomas and Anne, were immigrants from England. In the 1870 census, he is 19 years old and working as a clerk in a dry goods store. My bet is that was probably the Durmus store that was on the corner of Bloomfield and North Fullerton, but we don't know that for certain. In 1872, he starts a small bookstore in the Jacobus building on South Fullerton, names it Edward Madison, and that should say and Company, and he marries Melinda Ward from Livingston. He was very much a community man. He was active in the new town. Remember, this is only, a few years after the Civil War and a few years after Montclair had become a separate entity. So he was active in this new town. He became the judge of elections, the town clerk, the clerk of elections. He was a member of the first hook and ladder company that started up, and that's pictured on the left at top in 1882. He helped start the YMCA on Bloomfield Avenue in 1891, serving on their board of directors. That's Bloomfield Avenue, believe it or not, down there in the bottom corner. And that was the building that the YMCA was in before they built the place on Park Street. He was one of the corporators of the Montclair Savings Bank in 1892. And he was active in the Board of Education and at one point served as their secretary. So Edward Madison's business continued to grow. He added a small printing press to his store and began to publish a newspaper. He had a large room for community meetings and events that was known as Montclair Hall. As the Secretary of Board of Education, he carried a full line of books for children and young adults. And then he moved to this building, which is the Morris Building, very briefly. This is the building that is currently where the Montclair Savings Bank used to be, the bigger building. This is the building that was there beforehand, where Bloomfield Avenue and Glenridge Avenue intersect. These are a couple of the things he was publishing. He did Madison Directories, which are basically like phone books, but minus the phones. So it tells you who lived where and often what their occupation was. The book on the right is The Evolution of a Suburban Town by Edwin Goodall. That's one of the staples that we use whenever we're researching this kind of program. And then today after the noon program, somebody shot me these images. He also published this book of postcards There were 100 images of Montclair in it, and he sold them for $1 in a mailing envelope for holiday gifts. And this was from 1901. So he moved into the Durmus building. He briefly went over to Church Street, then he moved into the Durmus building, which is this building. And his business did continue to grow. In 1906, he incorporates and brings his son Fred into the business, and that's Fred on the picture right here. That's his son. Also Ernest Bush. He's not the guy on the other side of that picture, but he brings in Ernest Bush, who served as his clerk way back in the 1880s. And Fred handles all the finances. By now, it was not just books, it was also artware and bric-a-brac and plaster busts. And you can see on the article from the Montclair Times on the right, how it really, they talk about how this place was just chock full with everything. Not a square foot of space was wasted in the display of object art, for the walls were lined with paintings and etchings and watercolors, while the counters and shelves fairly groaned with their supply of lamps, teacups, pitchers, and plastic replicas of Psyche, Venus de Milo, and other subjects of equal importance. They decided, Fred and Edward decided they were going to build this new building in 1912. It is still known as the Madison Building, but then it was known as Madisons Folly. And the reason was it was a 4-story building, but believe it or not, it had an elevator, and they just thought that was crazy. So it was designed by Van Vleck and Goldsmith, and it was really quite a remarkable building. And you can see the balustrade up on top, which is very, very pretty in person. And then the horizontal lines we'll get to in a minute, but just keep in mind what they look like on the outside of the building. This is the interior of the building. It was designed like an atrium. And so you had 4 floors with these decks, concrete decks around them and railings. And you could look down onto the first floor, and it was lit by this beautiful skylight. Now, the building was designed to try and keep all arts-related professionals under one roof, so architects, painters, and printers, for example. And he was a really smart guy, because he figured if he's selling all that stuff downstairs, if somebody needs a new pencil, where are they going to go? They're going to go right downstairs to him. They're certainly not going to walk across the street or anywhere else. So he really had a captive audience. Remarkable building. This is the exterior. These are the horizontal lines I was talking about. These images are all supposedly images of Edward Madison himself, and the hands are all holding different implements. So it might be a paintbrush, it might be a pen, it might be some paper, but it really goes along with that whole theme of arts-related professions. This is Edward and Melinda at their home at 21 Forest Street in 1914. Unfortunately, he died in 1915, and Fred, his son, had predeceased him by a year. So the business passed on to Ernest Bush. Not sure when they went out of business, but Melinda passed away in 1928. But next time, if you happen to be walking up Bloomfield Avenue, make sure you take a look up and look at some of those images on those horizontal lines.
Jane?
Yes.
Can I just, one thing, when you were showing the skylight picture, the floors actually have glass block in them to help the sunlight filter through.
Yes, thank you, Helen, for pointing that out. You're right. Okay, next person, Don Miller. So Don Miller does not have a building, but his legacy lives on in other ways. He was born to parents Claude and Rena Miller in Summerfield, Jamaica, and they brought him here to the United States as an infant. Now, his early years, this is the 1940 census, and you can see Claude and Rena, and then he is here, and he's got other siblings with him as well. They lived at 16 Rosedale Avenue, and he was always an artist. There was a wonderful story in his obituary where it talked about he was always drawing during services at Trinity Episcopal Church. And the pastor was getting madder and madder at him because he was not paying attention. But then the pastor found out that he was drawing pictures of him. And then all of a sudden it was all okay. He had his first art exhibit at the Montclair YWCA when he was just 12 years old. This is the Montclair Y during that period. It is, as you probably know, it was when it was down on Glenridge Avenue. It was the former home of Israel Crane, and that is one of our properties today. He graduated from Montclair High School in 1941 and went off to serve in the war. There were 3 artists working with him, and he didn't serve in a way that a lot of people do. He actually drew for a mimeographed GI daily. And the Montclair Times wrote an article about it and said, these cartoons have captured the peculiar Aleutian humor so successfully that their popularity surpasses that of other GI comics. A half dozen camp papers on the chain copy the cartoons as a daily feature, and several were published recently in Yank, the Army newsletter. And for that, he said that he should open up his own syndicate and call it the Aleutian Art Syndicate. He came back and studied at Cooper Union in the Art Student League and graduated and started working as an ad agency. He married his wife, Julia, and wound up quitting the ad agency because he actually despised working there and instead became an art director at a New York store. They moved into Stanford Place, number 14, integrating that block, and initially they did meet with some resistance. But there were a couple things that really stood out in his mind, according to his obituary, as sort of seminal things that happened to him. The first was he was at a PTA meeting at Grove Street School, which is now the Darren School, and Julia was very involved in the PTA, and it led him to the realization that the early reading books didn't show any minority students. So he created pictures using the neighborhood kids and shipped them off to 2 different publishers. Well, the funny thing was, apparently both publishers wanted to meet with him on the same day and the same time. So rather than try and reschedule one or work something out, what he wound up doing is he went to one, Julia went to the other. Both publishers bought into the idea, and he worked for both of them at the same time. Another thing that really moved him was his trip to Africa to study its art and culture. He did return to Africa again when he was documenting the drought in the Sahara. But what's so remarkable about him is the breadth of his use of media and the types of work he did. These are 2 scratchboard etchings that he did. You've got photography, you've got oil, and even illustrating some of the children's books. The legend of Jocko, interestingly, is a legend about the Revolutionary War. We don't know how true it is, but supposedly George Washington had Jocko Graves was his name, and he was a young African-American boy who was working for George Washington. Whether he was working for or enslaved, we don't know. But George Washington thought it was too dangerous for him to cross the Delaware. And so he told him to stay on the one side and just keep the light lit so that he knew where to come. Well, apparently Jocko didn't make it because it was so cold that he froze to death. And George Washington had a statue cast of Jocko holding the lantern. It was known as the Faithful Groomsman, and it was installed at his Mount Vernon estate. And that is supposedly the prototype for all of those lawn jockeys that you see, or you used to see more often around on people's lawns. Again, not sure how true it is, but sharing it with you nonetheless. He was very active in the community as well. He served on the library board and was their president for 4 years. He was a member of the Essex County Cultural and Heritage Commission. He was executive board of NAACP, Fair Housing Committee, Greater Montclair Urban Coalition, and finally the American Red Cross. This was his studio at 363 Bloomfield Avenue. The one on the left is what it looked like probably around the time he was working there. Bad fire in it, and the one on the right is what it looks like today. But then he was commissioned to do by the National Library in Washington, D.C. to do a mural that would be unveiled in January 1986 for the first observance of Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday as a national holiday. But his studio space in the other place wasn't large enough. So he was able to rent a space in this building, kind of across the street and down a little bit at 180 Bloomfield Avenue. And what's so cool is that today it's actually, well, I think he was on the second floor, but the third floor is up for rent today. And that means that they've got pictures of it online and we get to see what it looked like. And this is it. Large open space like that, 13-foot ceilings, 23 by 70 feet. Here's another picture of it. And it was perfect because his studio, or his mural rather, was 56 feet long by 6 feet high. So it really gave him the space that he needed in order to create this work of art, this huge work of art. And Mike Farrelly said, the town historian said at one point that he'd even heard that he had to open up one of the walls in order to get it out. Whether that's urban legend or not, I don't know. But here it is hanging in the Martin Luther King Library down in DC. And I'm just gonna quickly run through some of the pictures in it because the imagery in it is really kind of remarkable. And he really studied hard to make sure that he was getting accurate images of the people that he portrays in here. So this is the first panel, and you can see that there's his home on Auburn Street in Atlanta. You see him graduating from Morehouse College. The two people on top are two people he really admired, Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Benjamin Mays, who was a Baptist minister and civil rights leader. On the second panel, we see the Montgomery bus boycott with Rosa Parks and some of the leaders who participated there. You also see in the upper right-hand corner, King and Abernathy in jail, and the Montgomery, Alabama State House down in the lower right corner. In this one, we see the founding of the Student Christian Leadership Conference with all of the founders of that organization. And the church in the bottom is the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where he was the pastor. This is King, Coretta, and his family. And you see the children in the Birmingham jail. On the top right, you see two of the victims of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. You'll see the other ones on the next slide. And also, you see the protesters being hosed by the police. And somebody on the afternoon call said that he actually got his children and his neighbors to come out and pose for that and drench themselves with hoses so that he could see and accurately portray how the clothing draped when it was wet. This is the symbolic march voter registration. And you also have the March on Washington. These are the other people who were part of the Baptist church bombing, and there are the firemen with the hoses. And the final panel is this one. You see Martin Luther King receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, Operation Breadbasket, images of the Vietnam War, which he heartily opposed, the Memphis sanitation workers strike where he was assassinated, and finally his crypt in the corner. So really a remarkable piece. The public library in Montclair has his working copy of this. So it's what he was working on before he went large scale. And you can actually see it when the library reopens. I don't believe it's open yet, but you can see it, and it's really quite remarkable. And there is information about what all of these pieces are in it. Don Miller passed away when he was 69 years old in 1993. So again, as I said, he didn't leave his legacy in a building, but he certainly left his legacy, a building on Montclair, but he certainly left his legacy. Next person, Giuseppe Aiello. So Giuseppe was born in Sorrento, Italy in 1891. In 1904, he wanted to come to America because he wanted to be with his brothers. His brother Louis was older and his brother Gabriel was younger, but his father just wouldn't have it. And he said to him, look, you want to go on over, you have to pay for it yourself. And so Giuseppe did. He actually was already part of the Italian Merchant Marines. So he boarded the Neapolitan Prince, pictured there as a deckhand, and sailed off to America. And 1 month later, he was sailing past the Statue of Liberty. When he arrived, his brother Louis helped him find his first job working in the grocery store that he was working in. That was on Amsterdam between 85th and 86. And within 2 years, Louis and Joe, who's now called Joe and not Giuseppe, started their own store in New York City. And then 2 years after that, they bought this store in Lake Patcong, which at the time was a very fashionable resort area. In the 1880s, the Hotel Breslin had been built. That's on the left-hand side. And it was really very posh. It was kind of equivalent to the Hotel Sagamore in Lake George. And it really brought all the best people out to Lake Patcong. And some of those people were families from Montclair. And that made Joe realize that that is where he wanted to be. And so sure enough, he comes to Montclair and opens up the first store in 1909 on the corner of Bloomfield Avenue and Park in front of a group of stables. And this is a 1906 atlas. And if you see where the circle is, the pink building was probably the building that he would ultimately rent. And those little yellow boxes with the X's in it are probably the stables that he was talking about. Now, he met with some resistance because he was Italian, an Italian immigrant, and people didn't want to work with him. But his philosophy was, I'm just going to keep smiling and providing good products, and pretty soon people came around. He was primarily selling produce to begin with, but then realized that Montclair just didn't have a good supply of meats, and so they began to offer meat as well. And what I love is some of the prices, that you could get a shoulder of lamb for 25 cents a pound back then. So these are ads that came out of the Montclair Times in the 19-teens. And then he also, in the 19-teens, married a woman named Julia as well. So this is from the Montclair Times, and I love it. I'm going to read it to you. One June day in 1914, Mr. Joe was married at Lake Patcong. Prior to the ceremony, he put up some orders and delivered them. He hired a car, got married, took his bride on a boat ride around the lake, and then went to New York City to market. It was not until 14 years later that he and Miss Julia Aiello enjoyed a real honeymoon. So quite a worker. This picture, some pictures just tickle me, and I just have to include them. He won first prize in a window contest sponsored by the Montclair Chamber of Commerce in 1921 in December. And this was captioned, "Gorgeous fruits from all over from all corners of the world." So in the late teens and early 20s, he also goes on a buying spree. In 1918, he bought up some property in nearby Caldwell on Brookside. He erected 3 stores, sold them shortly thereafter, and used the money to build this building on Park Street. That was around 1918, 1920. And it was a post office for many years. In 1919, he purchases 69 Porter Place, a garage around there. And then in somewhere in here, and I wasn't able to find the right date, but by mid-1920s, he also owned the Knoll Country Club in Boonton. In 1930, he was given a permit by the town to build across the street from his other building. And then in 1934, when the owner of the Wedgwood Cafeteria, which was then in that building on 22 Park, and you see it pictured here, when that was about to go belly up, he decided that he was going to take it over to protect his investment. And his brother Gabe came in and started to run the Wedgwood Cafeteria. And what's interesting is I've always heard from people about how great the prime rib was. And one of the reasons they said it was so great was because Mr. Joe would take the first cuts and give them over to Gabe for use in the Wedgwood Cafeteria that he picked up when he was buying the things for his store. In 1954, the brothers and their sons were all involved in the business, but Mr. Joe decided it was time to retire. So he began to divvy up all of his holdings, and the original meat packing business was given to 6 faithful employees who'd been with him since the early days, and he passed away in 1964, 10 years later. But what's so interesting to me was this represents the buildings that he owned on Bloomfield Avenue by the time he dissolved his properties in 1954. So you have the big one here on Park, and then 3 other buildings, plus the country club, plus the one on 69 Porter Place. And so he really did quite well for a kid who sailed out of Sorrento, Italy, not speaking a word of English, as a deckhand. This is the part of his obituary from the Montclair Times in 1964. And they too, in this, comment on how he had a meat and produce firm, a restaurant, a real estate holding firm, and a golf course. And not bad for a native-born Italian who came to this country at the age of 13, unable to speak a word of English. So the next one is Louie Harris, and I know we have a bunch of Louie Harris family on the phone. So you will actually see I've done a little bit more research since this morning, given the clues that you gave me. So I'm just going to dive right in. Much of what we know about him, we have from a 75th anniversary article about the store, and a few pieces of primary data that I've been able to collect. So the early years is, we know that he was born in 1855. Today I learned it was from a town known as Vorden in Prussia, which is now Poland. He immigrated when he was 12 years old. And the story went that he came here alone, but I had no documentation for that at the time. But then I found, after hearing what you had said to me today earlier, that he had worked rolling cigars and then bringing his family over, I found in the 1870 census that there was a Louis Harris, spelled a little bit differently, but the right age, living with the Schwerin family in Newark. And Mr. Abram Schwerin was actually a cigar manufacturer. And look at how they spell cigar, S-E-G-A-R. I love that. So he was a cigar manufacturer, which makes sense that Louis, who was living with him, or Louis, who was living with him, was working for him. 1880 census, he has come to Montclair, and he's living, it appears, with just 3 other family members. We have his father, I'm assuming, at 66, his mother, Hannah, at 66, and his brother Jacob, who's 2 years younger than he is. In 1883, he marries Miss Jenny or Jeanette Mitchell of Philadelphia. And I had thought, now, why would he have known somebody from Philadelphia? And the family today confirmed that indeed, as I had suspected, they knew each other from the old country. And they told me today, and I love this story, that he actually walked all the way to Philadelphia to pick her up and bring her back to Montclair. This is the 1885 census, and you can see now there are more Harrises here, and he is living with his wife, he has also started his business at this point. The business was started in 1875, so quite a while before that. This is a picture, this was his slogan, Montclair Business for Montclair Residents, operated by Montclair people. It was a dry and fancy goods store, and I have to admit this is probably the worst picture I've ever used in a presentation, but it was the earliest picture I could find. Somewhere in there, you should be able, or you might be able to see, Mrs. Bertha Mitchell, who was the sister of Jenny, and she's holding Herman, who was the son. And this was taken around 1883, so probably shortly after they got married, they started having kids. And if you look closely, this post and this post are a hitching post and a gas lamp post that were there. Now, the story goes, when he started the business, he actually went to Philip Durmus, who we mentioned before. He owned this dry goods store down the road a piece on Bloomfield Avenue. And Durmus, supposedly, he counseled him and told him the best way to start up a business. But he also said he would discontinue selling his own dry goods so that the kid could get a leg up and really begin his business. So I thought that was a sweet story about the beginnings of the business. These are some images from the Montclair Times from the 1880s, showing you the kind of things that they sell. Black stockings, spring goods, dry and fancy goods, caps, straw hats, oilcloths, ribbons, etc. According to his brother Herman, who addressed the Rotary Club in 1928, The store was open in the early days from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. on weekdays and from 7 a.m. to midnight on Saturdays. He said that in those days, half the business was done in a few hours on Saturday when the farmers from the outlying districts came to lay in their provisions for the upcoming week. And that when they finally knocked their hours down to 8 a.m. to 9 p.m., he was afraid he'd lose a lot of business, but he felt very modern. According to Herman, the store initially carried dry goods for everybody, but then by the time 1928 rolled around, quote unquote, the store's aim is to cater to the particularly exacting requirements of a very critical public, and nothing is purchased for its stock without reference to these requirements. Now, he had gone into this business with his brother Jacob, but in 1884, Jacob decided that he was going to leave and go into New York City. Whatever he did in there didn't work out. He wound up coming back and starting up a shoe store in Montclair that lasted for many, many years. The other thing I want to point out is the name of the company is the Beehive. It says Louie Harris proprietor, but the name of the company was known as the Beehive, and it stayed that way, I think, until right around his death. It was only after his death did I see the Beehive name just sort of fully disappear. In 1897, the business has grown and he's moved to a new location. He's now directly on Bloomfield Avenue, which is great for his business. And you can see the Montclair Times talks about how deserving he is of this success. And this is the 1900 federal census, and this kind of gives us a little sense of him. We see that he is living there with his wife, Jeanette, and they have their children, Herman, Jacob, David, Hilda, and Irving. They also have a servant, Annie, who was from Russia. They're living at 537 Bloomfield Avenue, perhaps above one of the stores at this point. They have lost one child. Apparently, Jeanette had had 6 children, and they now have 5 living. The house is rented still, and he's not a naturalized citizen. They did, however, move into this house at 1 Upper Mountain, and this truly became the family homestead. And I'm sure that some of the family members have fond memories of it. It is now divided into apartments, but I just loved the front porch, and it was a half-mile walk to 5-minute walk rather to the store, so it was really a perfect location for the entire family. There were some not so great times. This I found in 1906 in the Montclair Times, that a cartridge ball was fired from a revolver or exploded on the car track and pierced his window, or the window of the dry goods store. This could have just been an accident. It might have been an act of anti-Semitism, because he did always announce that he was closing for Rosh Hashanah and the Jewish holidays. So we don't really know the answer to that. We also know that in 1928, when Herman was chatting with the Rotary, he said that merchandising in Montclair in the days when it was necessary for the proprietor of a general store to keep a stout club alongside of him at all times, as much as to keep his wet customers, I assume that means drunk, in order as a protection against would-be robbers. So we really don't know how or why the cartridge ball went through, but we know that being in business back in Montclair in the early days was no easy thing. Couple other ones that tickled me. You could get your muslins there, your muslin undergarments there. And the ladies were delighted with these handsome assortment, and quick come now because the sale ends tonight. And then also in 1911, he and his wife, Jeanette, went down to Atlantic City for 3 weeks, which I loved because he was such a hard worker. I was really glad to see he was taking a vacation. I'm assuming they closed the store because Herman and Jacob of Upper Mountain Avenue also, they were living there, also went away for a couple of weeks to spend some time at a lake in New York. So that was 1912. Louie Harris died in 1911. Louie Harris died in 1912. And they say that death was due to heart disease. He was just 59 years old and was survived by his wife and 5 sons and several brothers. And it said that Mr. Harris was a man of quiet, retiring disposition and much esteemed by his many acquaintances. And he was in business here longer than any contemporary merchant. The store continued for many years. Herman Harris, their oldest son, was with a department store in Newark. and he came to run the business after his father's death. And in 1914, he was joined by David, his brother, who had been in wholesale manufacturing in New York, and they started to run the business at that point. It was then that they opened the store that we all know today, and that was in 1914. This was the advertisement leading into it, talking about how it was a real daylight and well-ventilated store. Everything was bright and pleasant, and where all the merchandise was fresh and new, and the salespeople seemed cheerful and obliging. And then after the opening, which 2,000 customers came to, he ran an ad. They ran an ad with thank yous in it in the Montclair Times, expressing their joy and their delight with their customers. This is the building itself, one of the interior shots. And here's another interior shot that I found as well in the Montclair Public Library Local History Collection, where almost all of these pictures have come from, unless I cited otherwise. And before I move off of that, I just want to mention, if you go to that store today, it does look a little bit different, but on the door, you can still see the name Louie Harris there above the door. And I think that's kind of a nice tribute that stays with him as well. So these are people that I didn't get around to, well, I wouldn't have had time to talk about, but that someday I'd love to talk a little bit more about. First one is Thomas Davis. Don't know a lot about him at all, but he was the founder of the first mill down on Bloomfield Avenue, way below Lackawanna Station. I suspect this is where it was. One of the early people in Montclair. He founded that mill in 1694. Alice and Grace Hui. Actually, I'm not going to do any more research on them because Betty Holloway has done a tremendous amount of research. She did a presentation a couple of weeks ago, and that is available on our YouTube channel. These two women were some of the early African-American families in Montclair that had come north as part of the Great Migration. Really a remarkable family. William Evans and Florence Rand, who founded the Montclair Art Museum. Joseph Munn, this was his tavern. It's still there, but you have to climb over basically a fence in the Dunkin' Donuts parking lot to see it. And then Daniel Vincent Harrison, whose property is where Whole Foods is today. And the reason I'm fascinated by him is because he represented the union of the English settlers in Montclair and the Dutch settlers in Montclair as well. So I think that he'd be an interesting person to look into. And with that, I'm going to say thank you, stop my screen sharing, and open it up to any kind of discussion anybody might want. If you do want to say something, please just do me a favor and unmute yourself if you can.
Jane, it's Kathy.
Yes.
A couple things I noticed. When you listed the children, you left out my father. He was the baby.
When was he born, though? That was the 1900 census. He might not have been
That's when he was born, in 1900, just so that you know. So
okay.
He may not have been on the census.
I don't think he was on the census, yeah.
July 28th, 1900. And my Uncle Herman, I noticed, all except for one place, his name is spelled wrong, which I find very interesting, even in the newspapers. He spelled his name Hermon.
Okay.
And I noticed it in one of the newspaper articles that it was spelled correctly. That was at the end.
Okay.
But I noticed it wasn't your mistake. I mean, wherever they spelled it, isn't it interesting? Because that was an unusual spelling of the name Herman.
And did you notice Lewis was spelled, well, Louis and Lewis, L-O-U-I-S and then L-E-W-I-S in different
But he spelled it L-O-U-I-S.
Right, but you know, that's how it was in the census. So it's
but it's interesting, yeah. You pick up on that, yeah.
Helen, what do we have in the chat? Anything?
Here. No, there was just somebody commenting that in the early days, Park Street didn't cross all the way over Bloomfield Avenue. So South Park Street was not opened until after Park Street existed. Okay. That is correct. At some point, Park Street ended at Bloomfield Avenue. Take my word for it.
And that's sort of where, I believe that was where the YMCA building was, right around Park Street, where Park Street would be.
So they must have condemned.
It's on Park Street, isn't it?
There was, she's talking about an original one.
Yes, but now it is on Park Street.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it is on, the Montclair Y is on Park Street, but the first one that I showed in that picture from the 1890s was facing Bloomfield Avenue and was sort of where the new Park Street on the other side of Bloomfield Avenue.
Right, but they moved it onto Park Street. Yeah.
Right.
Somebody commented that they bought we think we own an antique ribbon cabinet that came from the Harris department store, bought at a garage sale here in town. And on the afternoon show, somebody said she got married in 1970 because we were trying to figure out when the store closed. And didn't she say she got married in 1970 and bought all her like housewares there in the basement, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yes. Yes. And so what I found was
1971. I know.
Well,
that.
I know for sure it was open in 1968 because I bought my son Jeffrey's baby clothes there.
It was open in 1971 too, when my daughter went.
when I was doing the research, it looked to me like by 1972, I wasn't seeing any more ads for it. So it seems.
I think you're right. It closed shortly after.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
And Joan Moriarty comments that Madison descendants Bush owned Noteworthy on South Fullerton and did her daughter's wedding invitation in 2004. They lived in Verona.
Wow.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This is Marjorie. I thank you.
You're
My
very
mother was in
welcome.
charge of Girl Scouts
And Marjorie, tell everybody
for Louie.
who you are.
I'm Marjorie Harris Lesner. My mother was Lenora Harris, who worked in the store for a long, long time. And I lived at 1 Upper Mountain Avenue. And I still have friends that went to their schools with me. One was Eleanor Durmus. You know the Durmus names somewhere there.
Mhm.
And the other was Nancy Wilson. And I'm going to call him tomorrow. We'll talk about this. And that's cousin Kathy and Hi. And where did the other cousin go?
Ginny's there. She's
Where's Ginny? Ginny's
Janet was on the call.
I'm seeing a
She's
lot
on
of, and I'm seeing a
Ginny-
lot of people. Go on, I'm sorry.
No, Ginny's mother's my oldest cousin. She's 100. She's wonderful. Her name is Joan. Anyway, this is thrilling. Yes, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I there are a couple people in the comment room, and I've heard this many, many times before, was how I bought my Girl Scout uniforms. And
Yeah, my mother
Yep.
did all that.
Yep.
Yeah.
all bought their Girl Scout uniforms and their supplies there.
Yep.
Anyone else have anything they'd like to add about anybody? Harris's, Aiello's, anything? Anybody have recollections of the Wedgwood Diner?
Oh, yeah.
Yes,
Cafeteria.
of course. We
Yes,
all
we-
ate there.
Oh,
We ate there many times.
yeah.
Yes, we all did. We went to the movies, the Claridge or the Wellmont. It was all great. And then Bonds up in Upper Montclair.
Mhm.
That was a wonderful place too.
But I seem to remember going to the Wedgwood restaurant for lunch. Didn't they? Were
Yes,
Yes,
True.
always.
sure.
Right.
Yes,
Yeah.
I
And
think
there was a
that,
grunt.
that was my daughter's first jobs, working as a waitress at the Wedgwood.
That's wonderful.
All
Thank you so
right.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it
Thank
all. Hi, Jean.
Excellent. Great shift.
Hey,
It was
Excellent,
wonderful. Thank you.
excellent research.
See you in a couple
And
weeks.
Okay.
Thank you, Jane.
Take care.
Very
goodbye.
good.
Be well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Is it over?
Yeah, I think so.
The fat lady didn't sing. It's not over. So the fat lady sing. Go everybody.